My name is Rebecca Sealfon, and I am going to be the Jewish speaker here on this panel today. I would like to say welcome to all of you. I will be here with Nadia speaking about her experiences as a Muslim, and Joseph speaking about his experiences as a Christian. So I'm going to begin by introducing myself. I was raised conservative Jewish. We belonged to the conservative movement of Judaism. My ancestors came to America from Eastern Europe, different parts of Eastern Europe about a century ago, which means that I am Ashkenazi. Now, other branches of my family are Orthodox and Reform. These are slightly different movements besides conservative. And so I was raised with familiarity with all of them. Now, what is Judaism and what are some of the different types of Judaism? Judaism is probably the only one of these three religions that actually has a national tribal component rather than a claim to be a universal religion. Catholic literally means universal or drawn from a variety of sources, at the very least, as an alternate meaning of the word. And Islam also claims to be the religion of all people. Judaism does not. Judaism claims to be the religion of the Jewish people. And other people do not have what I would describe as Judaism's special mission. This special mission, according to the doctrines of Orthodox and conservative Judaism, was given to the prophet Moses on Mount Sinai. In written and oral components, these components were passed down through the generations, and they are what defines Judaism. Now, the differences between Orthodox, conservative, and Reform are how binding and how strict they are about interpreting the literal description of the mission of what Judaism does, and how literally the interpretation is of how the mission is given. Orthodox is the most literalist. Reform is not very literal. Reform basically believes in the traditions and not that they are actually binding law. Conservative is sort of in between Orthodox and Reform. The current movement that I belong to is called Reconstructionist Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism focuses on Judaism as a tradition, as opposed to Judaism as a theistic belief. I basically got involved with Reconstructionism because I liked my particular synagogue when my husband and I decided to visit it. So that is Judaism. There are also a number of other Jewish traditions. For example, a very significant percentage of the world's Jewish population is from the Middle East and North Africa, where movements like Orthodox, conservative, and Reform are not really separated into separate movements in the sense of having separate synagogues. It's more like that there is one synagogue that is traditional, and people are going to be following different things as individuals. And this is the case of much of the world's Judaism. Movements like Reform and conservative, they do tend to be the most prevalent in the United States, where I live, which it has a very large number of the world's Jews. It has about 40% of the world's Jews. So given that they are the majority of Jewish practice in the United States, those are still major movements. Reconstructionism is, which I belong to now, is related to those, but is much smaller, but is still part of the same family of movements. So now I'm going to cede the floor to Joseph, and he can begin with his story.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Joseph Saad. We're Roman Catholic Christians. I was born in Jerusalem before the Six-Day War, and my family is all Catholic. In Arabic, we say Der Latin to explain a Catholic Palestinian, which really just means the Latin religion. Really, that's what it comes down to. So many might say that the Roman Catholic tradition is probably closest to the original form of Christ our Lord. All of the different faiths of Christianity all tie back to our Lord Jesus Christ and the apostles and the Virgin Mary. Those things are basic to all Christianity. It's just that in Roman Catholic tradition, we have a bit of a different factor because there was a split in the church in the early days. So I was born Catholic. We came to Canada after the Six-Day War, and my parents followed the church for quite a few years. We were always going to church well dressed in our Sunday best, and did everything, participated in all activities. We were in Sunday school. We did summer camps for a few years. But as we grew older, and my parents too, things started to change in the Catholic Church. The liturgy changed, a lot of the beliefs changed. I remember when the rock and roll music was starting to play and we had the Kumbaya. My dad they enjoyed it and everything, but they just felt that the church was drifting away from what we were, and we just stopped going to church later on in our teens. Myself, I had a period in my life where I studied Ayn Rand and drifted far away from the church. And it was a long time before I came back to it. It was when I went to the Middle East for the first time in my 20s on my own. I had gone when I was a child in 74 after the war, but in 1984 and 85, I spent 9 months there. And I was on a tour with a bunch of priests in Tel Aviv, and we were going to do for supper, the whole group. There must have been 350, 400 priests on that tour. And as we were leaving the room, one of the priests that had gotten to know me, when we were walking down towards the dinner, he said, I know that there's something heavy burden, there's a heavy burden on you. There's something bothering, there's something inside you that needs to be brought out. He said, I'd like you to come and talk to me. And I said, and he said, come and talk to me. And I said, well, we can't talk. He said, come to my room and we'll talk. And well, we skipped the supper and we went to talk to him in his room. And throughout the conversation, as we talked, he was right. He lifted my spirits, and he was able to see inside me. And then I actually had a confession in the hotel room. At first I was, and this is a big thing in Catholic tradition to have a confession. I hadn't had one in many, many, many years. And I said, how can we have a confession in a hotel? He said, it doesn't matter. God is everywhere. And he's with us now in spirit. It's here. Now's the time. So I had a long confession with him, and it reaffirmed my faith. And after that, I really adopted my faith better. And especially when I was there in the Holy Land, visiting all the holy sites and touching those places and seeing those places, it really brought it back to me. So that's how our part of it is. My family traces back. There's a great uncle of mine that had done a family tree, and they said we converted to Christianity in the 4th, 5th century AD. That's when they converted. And we joined with another tribe that became a big tribe. And that's how we became what we practice now. In the Catholic tradition, there's basic tenets, and they all come back to the same thing. And because there's so many of them, I wanted to keep it as brief as possible, but I just wanted to let you know the main belief is the belief in Jesus, that he was conceived of the Holy Spirit through the Virgin Mary, that he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into heaven and hell, and he rose again on the third day. And he's seated at the right hand of the Father. He'll come back again to judge the living and the dead. We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. And that Jesus is God's only Son. So that's the basic tenets of Christianity. And then you have the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Those are the Catholic traditions that we reaffirm all those things. So when we go to Mass, we say those, usually they say the Apostles' Creed. And so that reaffirms all what I just outlined ahead. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the basic tenets of Catholicism. And for us, it's a big part of our lives. And I have pictures when before the war in Jerusalem, how big the celebrations were for Palm Sunday, for Easter Sunday, for Christmas. We have big traditions, and they carry through. And we have a lot of the European traditions carry with that, because there was so many people that came to Jerusalem on pilgrimages. So throughout the centuries, that's a big part of the Catholic and the Christian tradition in the Holy Land, is that the whole world community comes as pilgrims to go and see there. So you see people from all over the world. Some people come and spend all their lives in Jerusalem. They never leave. They were never born there, but they work through the church through their whole lives there. And I had many examples of that when I was there on my visits. So I hope that kind of helps you understand where I'm from anyhow. I'll pass it along to Nadia now, and she'll have her perspective.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Ramahi. I was born in Louisiana, but I was raised in Chicago, in a few suburbs outside of Chicago. So today I'm going to be representing the Islamic perspective. And I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of the basics of what we believe. And then I'll probably tell you just a little bit about my background. So in Islam, first of all, I love etymology. So I'm going to break down the meaning of what Islam means. Islam literally means submission to God, but etymologically speaking, if you take the root word salima, and if you were to explain what each letter means, it kind of takes you into a story of how you submit. So for example, the scene, the S sound, it sounds as though you are full and fledged, going forward. And then the lam means that it's something that's inside of you that you believe in. And then the mim means a surrounding. So when you say Islam, the part means that you're submitting. So you're submitting willingly to this belief in a higher power, which is the a sound in Islam, and the mim is supposed to mean that it encompasses you. So that's the whole meaning of what submission is to a Muslim. So we have 5 pillars of Islam that if you wanted to become Muslim, usually these are the pillars that you would follow. Usually you would pray 5 times a day. The second one is fasting. So if anybody's ever heard of Ramadan, that's where this pillar comes in. The third one is to give zakah, which is a form of alms that you would give. Typically, you would give 2.5% of your savings. So it's kind of minute, and there's also exceptions to that if you can't afford 2.5%. And the first and foremost, of course, was the shahada, which is your testament of faith. And all you would say is that there is one God, that he doesn't take any partners, and that Muhammad is the final prophet. So we believe that Muhammad came after Jesus Christ, and that he had the final message that is for all of mankind to follow. And the final pillar would be to go to Mecca for your pilgrimage. We call this Hajj. And it's just a signification of bringing all people from all over the world together, united in worship with God. So that's just the basic tenets. And then we also have 6 articles of faith. One of them is believing that there's only one God. And then we also believe in all of the prophets. So we believe in Abraham, we believe in David, we believe in Moses, we believe in Christ, and we believe in Muhammad as being the last prophet. And the third article of faith would be to also accept all of the messages that were brought down from these messengers. So we accepted the Torah, we accepted the Old Testament of the Bible, the Gospels, and finally would be the Quran. And then we also believe, as some articles of faith, like for example, we believe in angels, we believe of the Day of Judgment. The Day of Judgment is meant to bring justice to those that have suffered in their life, and all of us have suffered from something. So the idea behind it is that God will justify or help you in ways that that you couldn't seek out throughout your life. So those are just a few basic things about Islam. And finally, one of the articles is also Qadr. Qadr means to believe in God's destiny. So whatever he has destined for you, you would accept that matter as yourself. And for me, I take it as a challenge. So if anything comes my way, I just try to remind myself that it's meant to be and work my way through it. So that's God's way of preparing you for your higher self, since it's almost like you're evolving throughout your lifetime. So that's just the basics of Islam. And I will tell you a little bit about my background. So I actually have a mixed heritage. So my dad is Palestinian. He was from the diaspora, and he was born and raised in a little island called Failaka, which is part of Kuwait. And my mother was born and raised in Louisiana, and she was born as a Christian. And although my grandparents were not quite practicing with their faith, my mother always was very keen on religion. And so she started practicing more so when she was a teenager. And she ended up, when she went to university, she ended up meeting a few Muslims that had gone to her university, and she was quite interested in what Islam was. This was in the 1980s. So I mean, especially in the South, it was kind of unheard of. Islam was kind of unheard of at the time, especially where she lived in Louisiana. And she studied it a little bit. She wrote to the Saudi embassy, where the embassy gave her pamphlets and booklets and tape cassettes, teaching her about the basics of Islam. And then she converted. And a while after, she met my father, and I'm here. So eventually they moved to Chicago. It was a little bit difficult for my dad to find work in Louisiana, and he already had a few cousins here in Chicago. And so we made the move when I was about 2.5, me and my little sister. And we've rooted ourselves in Chicago ever since. So I have that background as well with Christianity, since my grandparents are practicing now, and have been most of my childhood. So that's just a little bit about me. With religion, religion has changed for me since I was a child. I mean, when I was a child, we went to weekend school. Weekend school is like where you learn your language, which we learned Arabic, and then we also learned Islamic studies. And eventually, when I was a teenager, things had changed a little bit for me. I think I'm going to break it down and talk to you guys about that as we correspond with one another. So I'll expand more on that in due time. Rebecca, did you want to take the floor?
Okay, sure, I'll take the floor. So I was also raised in a Jewish family. As far as I know, all my ancestors were Jewish. And this is fairly common for modern day Jews. Some people have a more mixed background, some do not. Another thing too as well is that the rate of intermarriage has also gone up. So for example, in the younger generations, having a mixed background is also more common. So my background is mixed in the sense of having ancestors that come from different parts of Eastern Europe. And it's also mixed in the sense of having ancestors that were involved with different movements of Judaism, but it's not mixed in the sense that all of my recent ancestors come from Eastern Europe. And it's also not mixed in the sense that all the ancestors that I know are Jewish. So the idea of preserving Jewish traditions was a big part of my upbringing. We were not fully observant to the letter, but Jewish practices were certainly emphasized. For example, we made a point of celebrating Shabbat every week and of observing most of the dietary restrictions. Shabbat, by the way, is the Jewish Sabbath, which is happening from Friday night to Saturday night. And also celebrating the major annual holidays. Another aspect of this was the need to continue Judaism, to make sure that my children and my descendants would be also know enough about Judaism and be involved enough about Judaism to care. And also that my husband be Jewish. My husband is Jewish. He is a Jew by choice. And he has his own story about how he came to that. But he is of mixed ancestry that includes some that is Jewish. Just not the maternal line, which is what traditionally you would need to be in order to inherit Judaism, inherit your status as a Jew. So as you might be able to hear from this, there are multiple ways of how being a Jew is defined. And the fact that he had studied about Judaism, he had taken the trouble to learn about Judaism, and he had thought about it in a systematic way, I found that because of that, we had the shared Jewish experience. Because it wasn't just that he was Jewish, it was also that he was taking initiative about being Jewish and actually thinking about how to be Jewish in a way that is fairly similar to mine, such that we are building a life together. And so those are some of the aspects of Judaism that I was raised with. One of my childhood memories involving being Jewish involved my bat mitzvah. What is a bat mitzvah? A bat mitzvah is a coming of age ceremony that Jews will have when traditionally when they're about 13 years old, which is the age that they have a special status in Jewish law. Now, in the United States, this has really turned into a big deal, a big party, almost on the order of a wedding. So it can be a really big thing. It's also can be different in different movements of Judaism because, for example, the liturgy between the different movements can vary. So my bat mitzvah was conservative, which meant that liturgically it was pretty close to the Orthodox liturgy, which is a traditional liturgy, as opposed to one that, say, congregants really had input into and wrote, which is something that movements like Reform and Reconstructionists can do. It was also almost entirely in Hebrew, the service, which is another difference because Reform and Reconstructionists, they will tend to heavily use Hebrew in their liturgy, but a larger percentage of it is in the vernacular, which in the United States will be English. And so the service, Jewish services can also be pretty long. The bat mitzvah usually happens on Saturday morning. Mine happened on Saturday morning. For a boy, by the way, it's called a bar mitzvah. It's called a bat mitzvah because I'm a girl. And so it happens on Saturday morning, and Saturday morning Jewish services are long. So they can go on for like 3.5 or 4.5 hours. There are several segments of prayers. And plus, you're reading from a book called the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, which is called the Tanakh. It corresponds more or less to the Christian Old Testament, which is not all the same in all the Christian denominations anyway. So the Jews have their own books of the Old Testament, the Christian books of what became the Christian Old Testament that they chose to use as core versus apocryphal. And so the Torah is the first 5 books, and on an annual cycle, different segments are read from the Torah according to a tradition of what segment. So the prayers and the Torah portion is what it's called, they both make up portions of the Jewish Shabbat morning service. And so people talk about what was their Torah portion for their bar or bat mitzvah. My Torah portion was called Bereshit. Bereshit is the very first one. It has Adam and Eve. It has Cain and Abel. It has everything up to the time right before the flood. It ends with that the people were being really evil. And then at the very beginning of the next portion, it talks about how God is going to start a flood to kill off most of them. But the end of Bereshit, my portion, doesn't quite get to that point. And so another thing that is customary in the Shabbat morning service is that the bar or bat is that someone talks about this portion. So if it's not a bar or a bat mitzvah, it's often the rabbi who's talking about that portion. But in my case, because I was the bat mitzvah, I was talking about this portion. Boy, was there a lot of material to work off of. These are some of the stories that were the foundations of Judeo-Christian civilization. Many other Torah portions don't really have that property. So I found that it was a very interesting experience, being 13 years old and being asked to do that. And I actually just got really into, as you might be able to tell by this point, my Torah portion and the things that were in it. So that is what I would say is one of the very meaningful Jewish experiences that I had as a child. Another aspect of this is that I was the first woman in my family to be able to have that kind of a bat mitzvah, to be able to actually read from the Torah, because in Orthodox Judaism, especially at that time, and even in parts of conservative Judaism then, women were not allowed to do that. My synagogue, it was called Kane Street Synagogue. It's in Brooklyn, New York. It's still around. It's still doing pretty well. My family still belongs. And Kane Street Synagogue had one of the early women rabbis not long after the conservative movement started ordaining rabbis. So I felt like, you know what, I could. So I actually led more of the service than most conservative bar mitzvahs do. I wanted to lead the entire service from the Pesukei Dezimra, which is the first section in the morning, to the end of Musaf, which is the last section in the afternoon, and actually read the entire Torah portion in between. So that meant that I had to learn a lot of melodies. I didn't know that much Hebrew, but I knew how to read Hebrew, which was certainly an advantage. And I felt very lucky and very proud to be the first woman in my family to even have a chance to have that kind of bat mitzvah. This was back in the 1990s. So many of my female relatives also had not been given the types of honors in the synagogue that happened at my bat mitzvah. And different people reacted differently. Some turned them down. Some were thrilled. Some were like, sure, we'll do what you want because we love you. So that was one of the Jewish experiences that I had early on that kind of shaped me. And so you stick around, you might want to ask me about what I think about Adam and Eve, for example. That was one of the things I had talked about at that time. But I'm going to pass it on this time to Nadia.
Okay. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about my childhood and how the religion encompassed our family. So we grew up in Bridgeview, which is a very popular suburb outside of Chicago. We call it Pallyville because there are so many Palestinians there. And before the mosque was renovated, it was actually quite small, and the congregation was pretty modest too. So mainly men go to the mosque. It's not obligatory for a woman to go, but we did used to go sometimes. And I remember being so little, there was like a glass room in the corner, and it was in a nice spot. There was a lot of sunshine there. And I remember following and trying to keep up with my prayer. It was usually like the daytime prayer. We call that Dhuhr. And some of my favorite aspects of the religion was for example, when we say our opening chapter, which is called Al-Fatiha, I really loved when we would all say Ameen. Like it was so melodic to me, and it was something that I really enjoyed hearing every single time. I enjoyed hearing the adhan, which is the call for prayer. I still do, especially when I go overseas. I do like to hear it outside sometimes because it's different. So it's just a unique experience to stop and then to remember God for those few minutes of your day. I remember, especially Ramadan, we had some little traditions at our mosque. My sister will remember this. We used to go with my dad before the morning prayer, which is Fajr. The idea is that you eat suhoor, which is it's like a breakfast that you have before the sunlight comes from the horizon. And we used to go there and eat, and they always gave us the strawberry milk that tasted like medicine. But it was just one of those symbols that I remember very fondly when I was a child, that even though I didn't like it, it's something that I look back on and it makes me smile. I used to go when I was older to Jummah prayer, which is the Friday prayer. We had two different imams. An imam is the leader of the congregation. One imam would usually say everything in Arabic, as per tradition. And then the second imam for the second prayer would usually cater to English speakers. And so I usually went to the second one. And after we would pray, there was always an uncle outside selling falafel, and that was just part of my highlight of the day, just getting a falafel sandwich. Or even for Ramadan, there are a series of prayers called Taraweeh. They are prayers that we specifically do in the evening times during Ramadan, and it usually takes place after we break our fast. So around an hour, 2 hours after, we would go to the mosque. And we would, I would love seeing my friends and just praying all together in those evenings. So those are just some memories. I don't know if my sister remembers this, but on Laylatul Qadr, which is, it's a holy night that we have during Ramadan. It happens on the odd numbers of the dates. So it can happen between the 27th, the 29th, of day of Ramadan. And we stayed up, we prayed, and we had boxes of lemon heads at like 4 a.m. So those are just some nice memories that we used to have. Same with our family. My dad's family actually is quite secular, and they always made these really cool Eid gatherings. They had it a few times at banquet halls, and I still remember my dad's cousin singing Fairuz songs, and I remember my mother buying toys for all of the small kids in the family, and it was really exciting to give them some toys. And so we had some really fun times when I was little that it made me feel proud to be Muslim. I didn't feel too uncomfortable. As I got older, a little bit of that started to change in a more positive direction, I would say, for me, and then for my outlook of all people, to where my version of Islam wasn't completely exclusive. I felt that I could branch out and become a little bit more spiritual in my faith, instead of being the type that strictly follows tenets of faith and rituals and things of this nature. So I did go through a period of change when I was a teenager that I think solidifies who I am today. But before I get to that, I can pass the floor to Joseph, and he can tell us more and enlighten us more about his childhood. I'm excited to hear more about what he has done.
Thank you, Nadia. That was very nice. It's true, and there's a lot of similarities to what you described. The big impact for us, of course, is coming to Canada. That was a big, huge thing. And one of the main things I remember from when we first arrived was my mother telling us that we're going to be Canadians now. We're going to live like Canadians. We're going to do like Canadians. We're going to do all the things and be Canadians. So that's what she told us. We're coming to a new country. This is how we're going to be. So she put us in everything. There wasn't any activity that she didn't put us in. If the school said that your child should do this, well, she made sure that we had this to do. And so she used to always, whether we liked it or not, you're going to learn to do it. And if you get asked at school, do you know how to swim, or do you know how to skate, or do you know how to do this or that? You're going to say, yes, even if you don't like it. It doesn't matter if you don't do it later. So that was the philosophy. And so that, of course, related also to the church work. And so when we were going to Mass, when we were young, and I remember my younger brothers and sister probably don't as much, but at that time, there was a lot of activities with the church and the community, and they used to have events, the Sunday events, and we'd go to Sunday school. Like I said, there was summer camps. There was a place called St. Mary's Boarding School run by the priests, and they used to have summer camps for the children of the neighborhood so that they'd get out of their parents' hair, and we'd spend 2 or 3, 4 weeks doing different activities with them. So those are things that we did a lot, and I grew up with a lot of that. This thing about being involved in the community, like we were in Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts. My sister was in Brownies. My dad was a scout leader. The things that we did with the community, it stayed like that until they kind of really stopped attending church as much. And in my later years, by the time I was 12, we had moved to a different area of town. It was a different life, and I had very difficult adjustment. It didn't work well, and I really broke off from going to church. And I used to have huge fights with my father about it. My mother would tell him, leave him, let him be. And so over time, I kind of broke the ice. I was the oldest, and then all of the rest of the siblings followed and did what they wanted. And my mom was always a voice for that, to give you freedom. And that was one of the things I always remember, was that we came to this country so nobody can tell us what to do, what to think, how to say, what to say. And those are important things. So that carried on in our later lives. By the time I got married and had children, of course, like Rebecca had discussed, and Nadia too, there's certain things that you're expected to pass on to your children, belief in your faith. And so in Catholic tradition, there's the communion, your first communion, which is very important. That's when the child, for the first time, has the body of Christ. And then in confirmation, which usually is around 14, 15, depending, you confirm your beliefs in like the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, those beliefs that I had outlined before. So those things we did, all of them, and we passed them to our children as well. By the time they got to be teens again, some of them strayed far from the church, and some didn't. Some still believe in it, but not attending every time. Out of my nieces and nephews, there's all kinds. And in Arabic we have a saying, ashkal wal alwan, which means all kinds and all colors. So I think that kind of sums it up. There's all kinds of beliefs. So by the time I went to the Middle East, and in 1974 was the first trip back, like I'd said before, after the war, I got to see how the Catholic tradition is done in the Holy Land. It's quite different than here. And then in 84 and 85 again. But I had 2 examples. And my godfather, who I had not seen since the 67 war, he worked with the church all of his life in Jerusalem. He was a very formal man. And so when I had got to meet him in 1984, 85, my aunt encouraged me to try to see him all the time. So he made time for me on Sundays. That was his thing. I had to take the service from my aunt's house. The service was like a certain taxi that runs back and forth on a certain route. It doesn't cost a lot of money. and you get on and off wherever you want. So I take the service from my aunt's house to the church, meet him there, participate in mass, and then we go back to his home, have a nice afternoon dinner, because there they have the big dinner in the afternoon and a small light snack in the evening. And we would either drive around Jerusalem with his car after eating, and he would show me the sites where I was born, where the homes of our families were, and all the sites around Jerusalem. And then I'd go back to my aunt's house. Now my aunt, she was stuck in Jerusalem after the 67 war, and she had to take care of the office of her uncle. And so she was a businesswoman long before there was Arabic businesswomen. And I mean, especially that type that was wearing business suits and dealing with the Israeli authorities, the Arabic bus drivers, the Arabic tour guides, the hotels, getting all the little things that have to be done, and to get tourists come out, and to make sure everything runs smoothly. So she was very preoccupied with that, and that was her whole life. And when I went to see her the last time in 2019, she was still going to the office. She was almost 90. But she never had the time to, say, go to mass every Sunday, do all kinds of activities, although she did do huge things for the community and was a very good Christian. She used to tell me, God understands. And I, on Sundays, I have to clean the house, do my laundry, get everything ready for the week. But I thank God every day that I'm doing that. And when I'm working on Sundays, I especially thank him. He understands that. And I'm a good Christian. I do a lot of things, even though I don't go to church all the time. And, and so I think that I adopted more from my aunt than anybody else, that type of philosophy. And I do go to mass when I feel it's appropriate. Sometimes I just go to church when there's nobody there. And sometimes I'll meet a priest or a nun and talk to them. But I don't necessarily feel that I have to go to church at 10 o'clock every Sunday and put on this big thing when there's so many things going on in my life. So those things, I think that we worship our Lord in our own way. And I think God understands that. So, that's where I have been with that part of it, and I take great comfort in reading the Bible a lot of the times. I read passages, I read a lot from it. But I have to say that there's a lot of difficulties in practicing the old ways of religion with the way the world is now. And my children, they have their own lives, and some have lifestyles that wouldn't be acceptable to the church. And that's unfortunately the way that things go these days. That's how I found it to be. Anyhow, but when I go to the Middle East, I do see a different tradition. And my parish where I got married is the oldest church in Edmonton of the Catholic Church, is one of the oldest ones. And so when I went to that church the very first time, it was a long time before I got married, that church, for some reason, as soon as I entered it, I felt like it was on the Holy Land, and I felt that presence. So that's my only real church. And I don't feel the same going to the other churches around, and I've been to the other churches, So in terms of practicing Catholics that I've seen, there was some outstanding priests and nuns that helped me in my adjustment period in Canada. The first one was Sister Nadia. Everybody knows her here. She's very well known. She did a lot. And when I was first new to Canada and not knowing traditions and customs, and I was the oldest, like I said, I didn't have anybody to tell me, oh, this is how you do this. She was the one. And so she would, I gave an example the other night for Rebecca and Nadia. How do you talk to a girl, and there's nobody to tell you. My dad certainly wouldn't be discussing something like that with me. So she told me, she said, well, smile at her. And if she smiles back, then you can open a conversation with her. Once you start talking, keep talking, so that it stays comfortable. And you'll know from that how things are, and she would tell me and how to relate to some of the kids and some of the problems, She taught me the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. And it helped me a lot. Also, I had Father Albert, who helped me with my temper, because of course sometimes I had a very bad temper and I would get into a lot of fights in school. That's a fact, And when I got married, I met Père Bougeot and Sister Dolores, and Père Bugeaud actually worked with Palestinian refugees in the past, and he's considered for sainthood actually in the church here. So he was the first person to me that had come to me and said, I know what it's like. I know what it must have been so difficult for you to come and have a new life here. I know what you must have been, the oldest, you had everything there and you came to nothing, now just your parents. He said, it must have been very difficult, my son. And he really was, there was a sort of relationship that I had with him that I never had with anyone else. Sister Dolores was similar. She was working with the same parish, and all through our married life with the children growing up, we used to meet with her sometimes after Sunday Mass and take her out for lunch or brunch. You know, they had dinner at my parents' home. So there was some individuals and some things, but for a large in part, it seems to me that the Catholic Church is changing, and there's a lot of questions being asked about some of the beliefs we had. And it's a difficult process, I think. I hope that helps. I'll pass it back to Rebecca.
Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about my young adulthood, getting a little later into my life, as Joseph was talking about. So I'd grown up in a very mixed cosmopolitan community in New York. I went to a magnet public high school in New York, and it was very heavily Jewish. It was about 30% Jewish, also very heavily Asian. And so I met a lot of people of a lot of different kinds of cultures there. And I thought that it was a very interesting and broadening experience. One very interesting thing that they all had in common is that because the school was in New York and because you had to live within the city, they were all New Yorkers. So even if you come from the center of the city or the outskirts of the city or whatever cultural neighborhood you're part of, you still have a certain New York experience. You still probably ride the public transit. You still think about things in terms of the city. So that's just one sort of take-home message here, that despite this so-called heterogeneity, there was a commonality of culture at my high school. And so after high school, I went to college and graduate school. And there it was definitely different. There I was not living with my family. There I was living in the dorms. There I was eating with other students all the time. And they knew my weekly rhythms. They knew my daily rhythms. It was a much broader cross-section that I was sharing with other people. And it was also, there were fewer Jews, and it was also more noticeable that some people are more traditional than you are, and some people are less traditional than you are. That's actually a very common experience for Jews, that are to see a very wide range of beliefs, practices, focuses, and chances are you're probably going to end up not the most traditional, not the least traditional, because there's only going to be a few people on one end anyway, or the other. And it also depends how you cut it. So on the one hand, there were a lot of people who they seemed to be not very involved with Jewish activities. They didn't seem to know anything, but there was also a special building for Jewish students where they had, for example, a specially kosher kitchen, which is something that needs to be done in order to be in compliance with the Jewish dietary mandates, and synagogue services in there as well, and a number of other Jewish activities, in-house rabbis and in-house staff, things like that. And most of the people who went there had gone to Jewish day school, and they were fluent or semi-fluent in Hebrew, and they knew a lot more about the Jewish traditions than I did. So when I come in, and I almost had a different toolkit. I had to do catch up to learn about the facts, but once I knew about the facts, I had a very different toolkit because my parents were literature majors. They actually went to the college that I went to. So me being able to go there was part of continuing what had become a family tradition, even though both of them had been the first in their families to go to that college. But because they met there, and so they take us to the campus every single year when all the flowers were in bloom. So I applied early decision, got in, and I went. And they encountered a different Jewish experience. They encountered a larger number of Jewish students that were less stratified in terms of the way that they were practicing Judaism. I felt sort of in between the one group and the other. But once I could learn the facts and the text about Judaism, I could come in with my own toolkit. My parents were both literature majors in college. So, for example, when I was analyzing this Torah portion, and when I was analyzing some of these texts, I was kind of reading about it like, in some ways, like how literature was being read in the 70s. In the 70s, the fashion of reading the literature was to bring in yourself into the literature. That was basically what the emphasis of the literary analysis was. So it was almost the opposite in some ways of how the Jewish day schools were teaching people to read the literature. They were teaching people to read the literature in a way that was much more based on Jewish tradition. So in my early and mid-20s, I was really fascinated by a movement of Jews called the Karaites, which was very significant in the Middle Ages, still around today, but it's pretty small. There's only like between 10 and 50,000 Karaites, depending on who you would ask. And their doctrine felt more like how I learned how to read literature. So that was one of the reasons that I was fascinated by the Karaites, because I felt like I could just walk in and have a place and bring in my own perspective. So I was actually talking with some of the Karaites about why I think certain things, because this was when the internet was still taking off. So being able to actually see Karaite websites, being able to actually write on Karaite groups, it was very interesting. And you could get more of the information and you could learn more about who are the Karaites, what are their different major subgroups, and what are their challenges today. And so when I was in college, I just got interested in the Karaites, basically, for that reason. I also wanted to do a little exploring. So I'd been to Reform services through other people, but I decided to check out the Reform service on my own. The Reform Friday night synagogue service. Friday night services, by the way, are shorter than Saturday morning, and they don't have the full reading of the Torah portion. They mostly have the prayers. And so college was really where I started exploring the different movements of Judaism even more than I had when I was younger. When I was younger, I really knew about Orthodox and conservative, but college, I really started looking into Reform and Karaite. And I thought that if Judaism presented itself better, we could have a very interesting and very compelling world philosophy that we could really think about better. It's like if you discuss an issue with only your own group, that has its risks. But if you discuss an issue with a bunch of other people from other groups, then you can see different angles on it. And you get different perspectives. So I kind of developed that view in college based on what I saw on my campus. And so I'll pass it over to Nadia now.
Thanks, Rebecca. Actually, I have a lot to connect with your story. I know that you felt that that you noticed a difference between traditionalism and then non-traditionalism when you were older as an adult. But when I was younger, because my maternal side of the family is Christian, it was always prevalent and present in my household that there was some sort of a difference. I think for my parents, because they were very conservative, for them, they struggled with how to incorporate that difference into our own immediate household. I think that both of them might have had fear play a huge role in having that exposure, even though we all of their kids, like all of us, we all went to a public school system. So we were also immersed with children from all sorts of backgrounds, and it wasn't something unusual or foreign to us. It became foreign when I became of age, like at around 12 or 13, where I felt like my household was the different one compared to my world around me. And so that's when I think a lot of my struggle started. There's one moment when I was a child that I vividly remember. It was when I was about 9 years old. My grandparents from my father's side of the family lived with us for a while after the Gulf War. And my uncle had come and he was looking for work here. And he was going to move out and have my grandparents move in with him. So long story short, they did find an apartment nearby and they moved. And I felt very saddened when they left, even though we were in a really tight rut. It was 3 kids with a newborn baby, my parents, my grandparents, and my uncle in a small 2-bedroom apartment. And I remember feeling this loss of connection because I somehow related more to my paternal side of the family at that point. You know, I would smell all the spices that my grandmother was cooking when she would make ma'luba, which is like an upside down rice goulash type of thing with chicken. I remember her making mensa. I mean, a little joke about that. I remember all of these senses. I remember in particular my grandfather, he was an academic and he used to wake up religiously at 3 a.m. to read all sorts of poetry, newspapers. He taught himself English. He used to record things from the newspaper by hand in his journal, and then he would later ask, "What does this mean? What is this?" You know, and it was something that really shaped us. So when I was about 9, I used to wake up as well. I thought it was normal to wake up at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And my father also was similar to my grandfather. I guess it runs in the family. And he used to read the Quran we have a melodic way of reading it. And then he would pray. So I used to watch him pray, and he caught me. I used to hide behind the couch because sometimes he'd want me to go to bed. And I used to insist not to go back to bed because I wanted to spend time with him. So he pulled me to the side and he said, "Did you know that when you pray, specifically when you prostrate, that you can tell God anything?" And I said, "Really? I could tell him anything?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay." So he left to his room briefly, and I wanted to pray. So in my prayer, I specifically asked God, I said, "Can we please move into an apartment that's near my grandparents and that also is it within the same school range, that I could go to the same school? And can it be 3 bedrooms, and can it be 2 bathrooms?" I had a whole list. And I even remember saying, "Can it have a dishwasher?" Because my mom used to have eczema when she washed dishes. And in 2 weeks' time, we got a call from the same apartment that my grandparents lived in, that they said that their upstairs neighbors were moving, and that it was 3 bedrooms with 1.5 bathrooms and a dishwasher, and it was all in the same school district. If I lived across the street, I would have had to go to a different school. So from that time, I felt so I felt like very close to my faith. A few years later, when I was 11, my mom really wanted me to wear a scarf. Hijab is a big deal for women coming of age to wear the scarf. And for me, I knew I had to wear it, but I wasn't ready to wear it. I wanted to make my mom proud, and I thought my mom looked beautiful in it. But for me, I was 11, I was still playing with Barbies. I didn't really want to wear the scarf. When I started to wear it, that's when a lot of changes occurred. You start to get treated a little bit differently. And it's confusing as well because I was really young-minded. I wasn't mature, I would say, enough to quite understand why those changes were occurring. So, you'd have a group of people treating you like an adult when you're still a child, or you'd have a group of people treating you as though you were an extremist or that you came from an extremist family. Then you would have other groups of people that would say, "Well, you're not American, or you're a foreigner. Do you speak English?" I got most of that. I got wild cards every time I'd go out when I was that age. I also lost a lot of friends. And so when I was in middle school, I was pretty lonely. There were a few kids that are now lifelong friends that I've been friends with ever since 7th grade. And those made all the differences for me. But my point that I'm trying to drive here is that suddenly Islam became very externalized, more so than it was how I remembered it when I was a child, where it made you feel something. And then as I grew older, I wore jilbab. Jilbab is a long dress. I wore jilbab mainly because a lot of the clothes at the time were not considered modest. So for a hijabi woman, she has to wear like a long tunic or a blouse that at least covers the thighs. The pants can't be too tight, these types of things. We didn't have the Target clothing that we have now. I mean, they have like, all my clothes are like from Target, and they're all so nice and long and modest. But at that time, there was no such thing unless you got it tailored. And so I wore jilbab, and that made things even more complicated. Most people, again, were treating me like I was not 15 or 16. People were then even pointing out, saying, "Well, why are you wearing makeup? you're wearing a scarf and a jilbab, like this is still wrong. So no matter what I did, my image was still being picked apart. And that drove me to a place that, as I remember, it was a very depressing time. I felt like I wasn't remembering God. I was thinking more about people and what they thought and their reactions. And so my way of practicing Islam changed, I would say, when I was about 16. And I started to become more interested in spirituality, the spirituality of Islam. So people like Imam al-Ghazali, he's a famous Imam from around the 1100s, the early 1200s. He would write these very uplifting types of pieces that served your inner core rather than caring about what everybody else thought outside of that paradigm. So it was a way of nurturing myself, and it helped me become a little bit more self-reliant as well. So that's my piece so far. Joseph, would you like to add anything with your story?
Sure. I wanted to touch a little bit on both of your stories. I noticed that, like for the tradition of learning and continuing education, I talked about communion and confirmation. So in the Catholic tradition, when a child is born, it's believed that the child is born without sin. And after a year or so, they've accumulated sin somehow. And so baptism is done where, again, Jesus forgives the sins. And so he's born into the family of Christ. And that's what baptism, and then you have the communion when you join Christ's body and you drink the wine, and in the confirmation. So those elements were all there. And in school life, that we had a religion classes, so we went through all those things. Now mine became problematic because I was born in Jerusalem and I had many questions. And sometimes the religious authorities, the teachers, they didn't like my questions. They didn't answer them, but it was very difficult. So, and I don't want to elaborate too much, just that in those years, there was, when I moved to that new neighborhood, the children in the Catholic school there was a lot of prejudice and intolerance and hatred. And I went through a lot of it. And it was very discomforting to go through something like that, because I see Rebecca, how she talks about her schooling, how it's different. Mine, they'd go to religious class and they would do the assignments to get good marks. But I knew that right after class, the school was out, I'd be facing those guys in the schoolyard, and I was born there. And I'd look at them and go, I was born in Jerusalem, you know that, right? We just covered this Jesus. And so it was very difficult. So I left. I left the Catholic school system. I dropped out of school. I completely left. And I came back only because I had to learn and get my education, but I went back to the public school, which was just a little ways away from the other school. Now, my siblings, like I said, they were so much younger than me that they had less trouble integrating in any of those problems, really. Although people that knew me, and from that school, that those kids that were my age that I had fought with, my sister was enamored with them because she was a few years younger than me. So they would talk about me, and she would say, oh, he's not my brother or something. But anyhow, I finished off my education on my own, away. And so everything became a personal journey to me. And that's why I discussed Ayn Rand. It became a philosophy for me. And it wasn't until I went to the Middle East that I reaffirmed my faith. But it was a personal journey. And so for me, it's more personal than a communal type of thing. But there is an asymmetry, and there is something in the Catholic tradition. And I just wanted to give you just a little bit of an insight about that. When I was planning to get married and I introduced my soon-to-be wife to my parents and asked for their blessing and phoned her parents for their blessing. And when we were all sitting together, just my soon-to-be wife, myself, and my parents, they were discussing my wife and my father were discussing their education, because my father was in the College de Frères in Jerusalem, which is all French, and my wife is French Canadian. So they were discussing those, and my dad blurted out a little song that he used to sing in class when it started in French, and she started singing right alongside it. And I was astounded, because he's talking about something he was learning in the 1920s and 30s in Jerusalem, and she was from the 1960s in Canada, oceans apart, but they knew the song, both of them together. And then when they discussed that I used to sing Petit Papa Noel and things like that, it was just tied us together that much stronger. And so the religion is unified, even though so divergent. And I thought that was interesting. And that was something that I always found when you meet another Catholic and you discuss something like that, it's those kind of tenets of our religion, they tie us together. So I wanted to add that, because that's kind of a came across. So I'll pass it back to Rebecca.
Yeah, so this is sometimes how I feel as well about other Jews, that there might be Jews who are separated by centuries, by 1,000 years, by living in a very different place for a very long time. And then they celebrate the same holidays, the same day, with many similarities in how we do it. So this is something that is really an accomplishment of the Jewish people, to keep that kind of a continuity. So even a movement like the Reform movement, that people say has changed a lot and has made a lot of changes, they still recognize the same traditions as such, even if they accept that, for example, not every member will follow any particular tradition. And so this is how things like the thought process in developing the Jewish traditions and in Judaism happens, because there is an overlapping fundamental set of assumptions that people have. And so you can be Jewish from Ethiopia, you can be Jewish from Iran, you can be Jewish from China, you can be Jewish from India, you can be Jewish 500 years ago. And even if you might be living in a very different place from where I'm living in, and surrounding culture, you're still going to have a number of key similarities. So that also, like, all the major holidays are pretty much the same. The major practices are pretty much the same. And all of that. Even with other related religions like Christianity and Islam, something like baptism, if you look at the roots, that's actually coming from a Jewish ritual bath called the mikveh, which is a Jewish ritual purification. And in Islam, the whole concept of Muslim monotheism is very, very, very similar to the concept of Jewish monotheism, to the point where the vast majority of Jewish traditions will consider Islam and Muslims fully monotheistic, and will place Muslims in the category of righteous Gentiles that are following all of the rules that Jewish tradition believes are applicable of all people. Unfortunately, Joseph, the state of Christianity is a little more gray in Jewish tradition, but many Jewish traditions, including the movements that I am connected with, would give Christianity and Christians a similar status as well.
Fair enough.
Yeah. We have to problem. We're doing okay with the Father, but the Son and the Holy Ghost are over the top for.
The Holy Trinity is a difficult concept.
Yeah. Yes. But also, yes, basically, yeah. And so, but still, Jews being a minority with traditions that are often very distinctive from the surrounding culture, we still can get singled out because we are in many ways less willing than other people to give up our traditions for communal shared experience with non-Jews. So I've had experiences of this in childhood and young adulthood, not nearly as bad, thank God, as so many other people have. So for example, I remember I was learning Hebrew, basic Hebrew in my synagogue. And so I was starting to write it in elementary school, which was a secular elementary school. And somebody was going and they were like, is this Chinese? Which is bigoted against the Chinese as well. This is also when Chinese were still considered a small foreign minority, even in New York. There are a lot more Chinese nowadays. And so I don't know why, but I was walking down the street, and this was a lot later for my bat mitzvah, to prepare for it, and I was carrying a book with some of the things I was going to have to read for my bat mitzvah. And I remember that I was covering up the Hebrew with my hand on the street, and it was like, and my dad was like, "You're ashamed of the Hebrew?" But somehow it had been ingrained in me, even though I had not really been called out on the street. And one of the reasons that we haven't been called out on the street is that my family does dress in a pretty standard American way. This is not true of all of Jews. Some people wear much more visibly Jewish clothing than my family does. And the people that wear much more visibly Jewish clothing in public areas, this is something that many people on the forum have, some people on our online forum have brought up. They do get harassed on the street. Nothing like life-threatening or incredibly dangerous, but it's still not good. It's not like every day, but it's semi-regular, and this can happen. And also, and that's really bad. Also, but our practices and our traditions are very beautiful. And our culture is very beautiful. And we run the risk of this if we stand out. But in my opinion, it's a risk worth taking to remain Jewish. And even though in the recent past, members of my family have actually lost their lives for being Jewish. The Holocaust killed 2 of my great-grandparents and forced my grandpa and his brother to come to America without knowing anyone, without even speaking the language. They were very lucky to be able to get on their feet in America, especially my grandfather. But what the hell? The Holocaust was also a pretty unusual situation in the sense that there was no way out. You couldn't hide. There was absolutely nothing that you could do to avoid it. The Nazis just had it in for the Jews as a heritage, and they were going to kill everybody who was of Jewish ancestry, no matter what religion they practiced, no matter what they were trying to do. And so part of that as well that I took from my family is just stand up and be counted. But also, if there's no way out, then that also puts the ball in your court about what to do, because it makes you not accountable. It kind of lets you do what you want if there is no way out. But even when there was a way out, like during the Spanish Inquisition, in theory, you could convert to Catholicism and semi-avoid the inquisitors, not completely. There was always people who were suspect, and the justice system was not too good then. And Soviet forced assimilation happened in the recent past. We don't talk enough about Soviet forced assimilation, which was bad on the order of the Spanish Inquisition in terms of its scale. But even something like that has been overshadowed by the Holocaust, despite its huge effect on the Jews. Not to mention, there were outright expulsions of Jews from other Middle East and North African countries, which is why the majority of the Middle East and North Africa is basically without Jews. So we have had pretty significant persecutions, and a lot of Jews think of themselves as being very lucky to be in America and hoping it stays that way. Recently, Jews have been beaten up on the street. It's been happening for a while, but recently there were some marches being organized to protect them. And also there were some shootings in synagogues. Anti-Semitism happens everywhere. A very high percentage of Jews, including nearly everyone Jewish involved in our online forum, has encountered some type of anti-Semitism on the internet. And what should we do? And so that's a very disturbing topic. I'm going to also add, we are not alone in being singled out. And I'm going to pass it on to Nadia.
So, branching off a little bit of what you're saying about hate crimes and also about trying to preserve some of who we are and our traditions. I remember I was 15 when 9/11 happened. 9/11 changed the course of everything in terms of how to live about as a Muslim and honestly as an Arab. So this also goes for Arab Christians, since 9/11 was a misnomer between Islam and Arabs. I had actually a few Arab Christian friends that attended the public school that I went to that were also very fearful of going back to school because they were afraid that they were going to be lumped in with what we had done. So it was quite a scary time. In fact, when it happened, I didn't know it happened. My father had apparently called the school, and I was notified by my teacher to pack my things because my father was going to pick me up. I went to the office. You know, my parents never picked me up, even if I was sick. It was really important for me to attend school. So the fact that he was standing there and he wouldn't say anything scared me. I thought that something happened in my home. And I kept saying, what happened? What happened? And he said, I'm going to talk to you in the car. So he took me back to the car and I said, what happened? He couldn't speak. He just put the radio on and I listened and I didn't understand too well. I was just understanding that some towers were hit in New York. And when I got back home, my mom had it flashing all over the TV to where I witnessed the attack. And I told my mom, I said, well, what does this have to do with me? Why was I brought home? Are they going to close down the school? I had yet to understand who had done the attack. And that's when she explained that the attack was done by Muslims. And I didn't go to school for the next few days. From what I heard when I was absent from school, there were a lot of fights, mainly from people attacking other Arabs and other Muslims. And some of my friends also didn't attend school for the following weeks. Not only that, but our mosque was also being protected by the SWAT team. It wasn't just the suburban police force that came, because they had messages that were sent to them saying that whoever these people were going to burn down the mosque and hurt the people that attended the congregation. So it was quite a scary time. I think that my siblings, because they had gone to a private school, I believe. I think they were also brought back as well. But going back to that, it just completely warped my world and everyone else's world. For one, it was so blatantly obvious who I was. So if I were to step out, I felt like a finger was being pointed at me. And that's when I think I received the most hate crimes, was during that time period. I remember walking to my bus stop and there was a car that kept circling around our bus stop, and they had a huge Confederate flag waving from their window. And I was crossing the street and he purposely sped and was trying to hit me. And instead he went off of the curb of the bus stop and he landed partly on that curb, and we all just jumped back and we were screaming and scared. That was probably the worst that had happened to me. And then I had my scarf pulled off several times. I've had fruits thrown at me. I caught one and I put it in my backpack. I try to make things kind of lighthearted, because that was the only way to cope. Because if I actually kept thinking about it more so, then it would affect me. So during that time period, I kind of went back to my roots, and I felt strongly about my faith. But that didn't last as long, especially when I married, and then I went to community college and I started working. I started to question a lot of my beliefs, especially because everything was so externalized, like how I had mentioned before. So I started to volunteer at my mosque, and I used to co-run a youth group for girls. It was called Mu'minat, which means the believing women. And it was mainly just a place of counsel. The girls really relied on me and would tell me their deepest, darkest secrets, kind of like how Joseph felt about the sister that he used to talk to and vent to. I was almost, in that position where the girls would come to me and vent to me. And that's when my mind even opened up more to see how many internal issues we have as an Islamic community that are not being properly addressed. They're kind of being thrown under the carpet, so to speak. So that's my take on it. As a young adult, I'm going to pass the mic to Joseph.
Thank you, Nadia. Yeah, I want to tie into some of those two streams of thought that you both had brought out. And Rebecca had talked about the internet. Of course, on our side, the most hurtful things, and I'm sure Nadia would probably agree, would be when people question your identity, or you're raised into that of being a Palestinian. There's no such thing as Palestinians. They're all migrants that came in the 20th century and all that other stuff. To me, it's the same thing as somebody denying the Jewish people have not had a tie to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, all of their history. It's a very frustrating thing. It's a stigma, and the internet can be very harmful. So unity as strength is one of the greatest things I found, is that it's so encompassing, and all of us together are such a community that we all support each other, and we look at each other's similarities, and we discuss differences, but it's always respectful. And that's something that I felt very welcoming. And I was very thankful for Rebecca for bringing me into that. In terms of 9/11, it was a big shakeup. I remember the day very clearly. And my brother phoned me. I was still in bed. He was an hour or so ahead of time. So when he called me, events hadn't quite come here yet. So he said, "You better turn on the TV." Then I saw the second plane actually hit. And then after that, I watched the attack on the Pentagon. My aunt from Jerusalem happened to be in Canada at that time. And my mother and my other aunt, all three of them were supposed to travel that afternoon to Washington. They were supposed to leave on 9/11. Of course, everything was canceled. So I had phoned them. I was scheduled to work in the afternoon at the library. And I phoned them and went for the morning brunch with them and talked. And my aunt from Jerusalem was my godmother. Like I said, I adopted a lot of things from her. She was my role model. I said to her, "I don't want to go to work. I don't want to go. I know there's going to be 100 questions. They're all going to ask me because I'm Palestinian. I don't want to go." She said, "You have to go." She said, "It's your duty to go. You have to go and do your shift. You have to go and do it like anybody else. And if anybody brings it up, you say, 'We don't know anything.' And that's it. You have to go." So I kind of buckled up and did it. I did what she said. And the days that came after were very difficult days, as Nadia had said. I got emails, lots of emails. Some were very threatening. At that time, I was involved with Wikipedia, and my name was out there because I used my real name. I had not thought of using something else. So a lot of emails came directed my way, and threats to my family, and I was scared. And I kind of really toned off and backed off. So that was a big trauma. The other thing that I don't know, and I'm sure that Nadia and Rebecca might understand, is when someone adopts the Palestinian cause and says, "Well, we did this for the Palestinians." So I was dreading that, because whenever something happened, some sort of a terrorist event or some sort of a big attack, or there was big problems, we always ask, is Palestinians involved? So we have Osama bin Laden saying we did this for the Palestinians. I was just like, we didn't want you to say, why did you say that? You don't represent me. You destroyed my dad's business. A year after this attack, my dad had to close his business. Every time there was problems in the Middle East, it affected my father's business. So this was something that, association by, I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very frustrating part of it. But if there's one thing that I wanted to bring back, and it comes back to, again, unity and strength, say, we have a common experience, Palestinians and Israelis, diaspora, the loss of homeland, the desire for a homeland, the desire of Jerusalem. It's central, and it encompasses every part of our lives. So every day we live with that. I'm sure Nadia does. And every day, and Rebecca too, is always conscious of the events that go on. It's always there, even if you try to get it away, even if you're having a holiday and it's there. It's always there. It's in the background. It never leaves. So that's one of the reasons for me that before I go, I'd like to see a peace. I'd like to see the new generation of children growing up with a common understanding and respect and love of each other. We owe it to the new generations to come, not to have to endure what has been endured all these years. So from that, I'll pass it back to Rebecca. I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. We've actually gone a little bit over, but that's okay. But we probably could do one last wrap up. So I would like to wrap up by saying thank you to Joseph for that. And thank you for one last wrap up among each of us. And so I'd like to say thank you to Joseph for that. And thank you for Nadia for sharing her stories as well. And I want to wrap up with that. I would say I feel very fortunate in terms of that I have had mostly positive interactions with both Christians and Muslims, in fact, especially in a religious context. I don't think that this is necessarily the experience of everyone, but this is mine. For example, I had heard a lot about the history of Israel's wars growing up and all the countries that were shutting Israel out. But when I moved to Brooklyn, when I was 6 years old, I encountered Arab-American culture in a very different light. They were the neighbors. They had stores that were very proudly Arab Middle Eastern style with a lot of products from the Middle East and North Africa. And these were just a few blocks away from my house. This is how I became familiar with things like Middle Eastern food. Because I grew up near a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Atlantic Avenue. Now, the question of, is this was nothing like the story about the wars. These were just neighbors. And when I came to high school and even college, I encountered a very similar experience. That these were my classmates. And in my professional life, these were my colleagues. I also studied engineering and biology, which are both STEM fields. STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So in STEM, the culture is also very collegial across divisions like that, because again, their shared experience is STEM. So all these experiences that I have had give me hope that it is possible to take all of these little interchanges that might not even make the news and use them as a model. Now, on all sides, there are going to be bad apples that spoil the barrel. Like, there is going to be violence if you look at the record of it. It's not only done by one group. And the question is, how do you turn the other thing into a model? And build a maximally cooperative dynamic and send that message that we are friends. In America, Jews have lived side by side with Christians for a very long time, and with Muslims in smaller but growing numbers. And for a long time, it's been pretty good. Most of my friends, I would say, are either Christian or Muslim. Some are Jewish, some are other things like Hindu or Buddhist, but a very large number are Christian or Muslim. And so this is why I have hope. Because I think that this type of dynamic can be expanded to many places where it is not. And so, with that ending, I'm going to pass it on to Nadia.
I just wanted to thank you all for being with us today. And I loved hearing Rebecca's stories, Joseph's stories. There were so many parallels that we can make. I think my driving point that I wanted to make between all three of us is that I know it sounds cliche, but it's almost like we're on a tree, but we're three separate branches of the same root system. And for me, since my grandparents are Christian, one of the things I loved about Christianity was this sense of ease. I felt like I could always unload myself to my grandmother without the feeling of being judged. There was always this hope that she would tell me that through Christ, that you could always understand that you will be forgiven. And I would take that and put it in my own terms that fit my own design, and I would follow that. And with Judaism, as I'm learning more and more, there is just so many similarities between our customs and our traditions. I mean, a lot of our Islamic customs have been borrowed from Judaism. Even there has been some from Christianity, but it almost feels like Judaism has it's like a home for me. Like it's something that makes me feel warm, and I'm so familiar with it internally that I feel like somehow you two have encompassed me somehow. So that's what I love most about our talk today. And thank you all for viewing, and hopefully we'll get to answer some of your questions soon. Joseph?
Thanks, Nadia. That was wonderful. It's true. I would tie into the same things. I'm wearing a shirt that has anchors on it. I don't know if you can see that or not. In our faith, anchor can symbolize faith, hope, steadfastness. So I feel that. And I bought this shirt, in fact, when I was going to Jerusalem in 2019 to see my aunt. It turned out to be the last time I got to see her, stay in her home. But I had gone with preconceived ideas of what I was going to do. I thought it was going to be similar in 1984 and 85, where I traveled all around, saw all the holy sites, did all the touristy things. But when I arrived, she had fallen a couple of days before. And so she needed care, and she wasn't going to the hospital on her own. So I took her on my own. We spent the whole day in Hadassah Hospital. We had to get x-rays, go back and forth. We were all day, but all day we were attended very well. Everybody was very kind to her. I remember one young nurse, she was fascinated by me in Canada. She said how much she wants to go live in Canada. And she kept coming and checking every hour, half an hour on my aunt, how's the pain? And I was really shocked. I was really, it took me to some place that I'd never been before. I'd never seen where the whole Jewish institution like that and how they were taking care of my aunt. And the two young men that were studying how her injury had happened and how they determined that there was only one guy named Valerie in Jerusalem that I could go to see that would be able to get her the right kind of corset for her back to support her. And we had to do a whole day's journey to West Jerusalem to do that. And then we went in the end, I had to make the appointment to go to see the specialist in Ein County Hospital, and I got to go there. By the time I came back to Canada, I had a very different idea of the Israel and what I had known before. And then I got on to, it was discovered that I had a cancer, and I've been fighting it, and I'm getting better. And my son got me involved with Reddit and Quora, and that's how I got involved with all this. And that also helped me to change my views and see a lot of different views. And so that's why I have a lot of optimism for the future. And I believe the young kids that are coming today, they're not going to care about all the old stories and all the old histories. And there's enough blame, and you can you can have debates forever if you want in rooms about all the histories. The new ones are going to want to have a new life, and they want to participate the way the world, and they have to be able to achieve on a world level, Palestinians and Israelis alike. And so that's what my hope is that, and I believe that it might not happen right away, but it will happen eventually, maybe in my lifetime, maybe not. But I think that by the time my children are through, there'll be a change in this world, and there'll be, if not peace, at least some common understanding in human rights and equal rights for both sides. And I really believe that's where it's going to end. I thought I'll leave it with Rebecca, and if we have time for questions or not.
Okay, so thank you so much for listening to all of us and all of their stories. I hope that you have enjoyed those stories and that you have learned a lot. And I hope that you can dial into our forums, connect to our forums, continue to connect to our community, and continue to see us. And with that, I will end the discussion.